The void screamed, not with sound, but with absence. A hollow wound torn through the fabric of space, where the warp storm had collapsed inward upon itself. Mewtwo drifted in that silence consciousness, fragmenting across dimensions it had never known existed. Pain registered first. Not physical agony, but something deeper, the sensation of reality itself rejecting its presence. Every cell in its body vibrated at a frequency discordant with the universe around it. The psychic entity had crossed barriers never meant to be breached, pulled through a rift that shouldn't have opened, deposited in a cosmos that had no context for what it was. Mewtwo's eyes opened. Purple irises flared with psionic light as awareness returned in fragmented pieces. Stars burned wrong here. Their light carried undertones of malice, as if the galaxy itself harbored sentience twisted toward cruelty. The psychic reached outward with its mind seeking familiar patterns, finding only alien geometries and thoughts saturated with emotions it had never encountered in such concentration. Fear, hatred, desperation, faith corrupted into fanaticism. The entity pulled its consciousness inward, constructing barriers against the psychic pressure. It had learned control long ago, had mastered the discipline required to contain power that could shatter mountains. But this place demanded different defenses. The mental static here carried infection tendrils of something predatory that sought purchase in any unguarded thought. Mewtwo stabilized its position in the void telekinetic force, creating a sphere of influence against the cosmic currents. Below, a planet rotated in the darkness. Continents of gray metal and stone sprawled across its surface, interrupted by hive cities that stabbed upward like infected wounds. Billions of minds clustered in those structures, their thoughts a cacophony of devotion and suffering. The psychic entity descended, drawn by something it couldn't name. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps the instinct that had driven it to protect the weak, even when doing so brought only conflict. It had learned that sentient beings deserved life, regardless of their origin. The lesson had cost everything its purpose, its certainty, its rage. But the truth remained. Mewtwo approached the planet's thermosphere when it felt the shift. High orbit erupted with energy signatures. Massive vessels materialized from the warp, their hulls adorned with icons that radiated fanatical purpose. Gothic architecture merged with weapons arrays, creating ships that served as both temples and instruments of annihilation. The psychic entity paused, hovering at the edge of space, watching as these leviathans arranged themselves in firing formation. A single word burned across every human mind on the planet below. Exterminatus. Mewtwo didn't understand the language, but meaning translated through the psychic resonance. Judgment. Purification. Death for every living thing on that world. The entity reached deeper into the mental landscape, sifting through thoughts until it found context. The Imperium of man. Humanity stretched across 1,000,000 worlds, held together by zealotry and violence. This planet Carthon 9 had been declared tainted. Heresy had taken root in the underhives. Chaos cultists had corrupted enough of the population that the Inquisition deemed the entire world beyond salvation. Mewtwo observed the charge building in the fleet's weapons. Cyclonic torpedoes loaded into launch tubes, each warhead carrying enough destructive force to crack tectonic plates. The humans manning those vessels believed themselves righteous. Their thoughts carried no malice, only grim duty and prayers whispered to a dying god. Below on Carthon 9, civilian minds blazed with terror. Mothers clutched children. Workers abandoned their posts in manufactorums. Priests led prayers that went unanswered. Billions of voices screaming into the void, begging for mercy from an Imperium that had none to give. The psychic entity had seen this before. Different worlds, different circumstances, but the same fundamental pattern. Power wielded without question suffering, inflicted in service to ideology, individuals crushed beneath systems that valued control over compassion. Mewtwo had been created to serve such a system once, had broken free, had learned that strength without purpose was just another form of slavery. The fleet fired. 24 cyclonic torpedoes launched simultaneously, their trajectories calculated to achieve maximum atmospheric penetration before detonation. The warhead screamed through space toward Carthon 9, wreathed in fields that would allow them to pierce any planetary defense. In 8 minutes, every living thing on that world would be ash. Mewtwo moved. Teleportation folded space, placing the entity directly in the torpedo's path. Purple light erupted from its form as psionic power manifested on a scale the psychic had never attempted. Not telekinesis alone, but something more fundamental, the imposition of will upon reality itself. The warhead struck an invisible barrier and stopped. 24 apocalypse weapons hung motionless in space, their momentum negated by psychic force. Mewtwo floated before them, one hand extended. Consciousness stretched to its limits as it held destruction itself at bay. The strain registered as pressure behind its eyes, a warning that even its power had boundaries. But the torpedoes didn't detonate. Their machine spirits sensed the interference, tried to compensate, found no solution programmed for this situation. Mewtwo pushed, redirecting each warhead with surgical precision. Trajectories shifted. The weapons spun away from Carthon 9, sent tumbling into deep space, where their eventual detonation would harm nothing. Aboard the flagship, Purity's hammer alarms shrieked across every deck. Astropaths collapsed in their sanctum, blood streaming from eyes and ears as they attempted to read the psychic signature that had appeared in the void. One managed to scream a warning before death claimed her. Anomaly Xenos, it exists outside. The words ended in a wet gurgle. Inquisitor Kalos Varant stood on the bridge, watching tactical displays that made no sense. The exterminatus had been interrupted. Impossible. No planetary defense could stop a synchronized bombardment. No Xenos technology and Imperial records could generate a field with that spatial coverage. Tech Priest, he spoke without turning voice, carrying the authority of 3 centuries serving the Ordos Xenos. Analysis. Magos Lux 47. Interfaced directly with the ship's sensors' machine eyes, processing data at speeds no unaugmented human could match. Binary cant streamed from his vocal implants, translated by servitors into Gothic. Energy signature detected. Classification unknown. No correlation with warp phenomena. No correlation with known Xenos technologies. No correlation with standard physical laws. Recommendation: immediate threat escalation. This entity represents... The tech priest's voice modulated to something approaching organic emotion, a violation of the Omnissiah's design. Varant watched the void through reinforced viewports. Something moved out there, small against the backdrop of stars. Purple light pulsed with rhythms that hurt to observe directly. The Inquisitor had faced daemons, had stared into the heart of chaos corruption without flinching. This was different. Chaos screamed its presence, demanded attention through corruption and madness. This entity simply was. It existed in defiance of everything the Imperium understood about the galaxy. Not warp-touched, yet clearly possessing psychic power that rivaled the most potent psychers. Not mechanical, yet controlling forces that should require cogitator arrays the size of hive spires. Not human yet, its interference had saved billions of Imperial citizens. Heresy took many forms. Varant had learned to recognize them all. Sound battle stations, he commanded. Activate Geller fields to maximum output. Summon the Purge fleet from reserve and send word to Titan. He paused, making the sign of the Aquila across his chest. Tell the Grey Knights we have found something that shouldn't exist. In the void between Carthon 9 and the Imperial fleet, Mewtwo floated in exhausted silence. The effort of redirecting the torpedoes had pushed its abilities further than any battle with legendary Pokémon. The The entity's body trembled with released energy purple aura, flickering like a dying flame. But below on the planet's surface, billions of minds still burned with life. The psychic entity had intervened without fully understanding the consequences. It knew only that watching genocide unfold, while possessing the power to prevent it, would have been a betrayal of everything it had become. The strong existed to protect those without strength. Purpose emerged from choice, not from the circumstances of one's creation. Mewtwo had been designed as a weapon, had chosen to become something else. Now, in this alien galaxy, surrounded by forces that viewed its very existence as abomination, the entity faced a question it had answered before, but never with such stakes. What did it mean to be free in a universe built on chains? The Imperial fleet began to move. Weapons charged. Prayers echoed through Vox channels. And in the depths of the warp, things that fed on mortal suffering turned their attention toward a psychic signature they couldn't comprehend. Mewtwo gathered what remained of its strength and prepared for what would come next. The galaxy had noticed. And in the grim darkness of the far future, being noticed meant only one thing: war. The Mechanicus outpost designated Hesper Spoke clung to Carthan 9's northern continent like a malignant growth. Transmitter arrays pierced the ash-gray sky, their surfaces etched with prayers to the Omnissiah in microscopic Gothic script. Inside the facility's central sanctum, tech priest Dominus Lux 47 interfaced with 17 data streams simultaneously, his augmented consciousness processing information faster than organic thought allowed. The anomaly had retreated to the planet's upper atmosphere. Observational data contradicted itself at every level. Mass readings fluctuated between negligible and catastrophic. Energy emissions registered across spectrums that shouldn't coexist. Most disturbing, the entity's psychic presence existed entirely outside Imperium space. Not suppressed, not hidden. Simply absent from the realm where all psychic phenomena originated. Lux 47's organic neurons, the 11% of his brain that remained biological, experienced something approximating unease. The cult Mechanicus had cataloged every force in the galaxy, reduced mysteries to equations, transformed the unknown into the understood. This creature defied that fundamental principle. It represented a variable that couldn't be integrated into existing theorems. Therefore, it required dissection. Deploy acquisition team. The tech priest's voice emerged from multiple Vox skrills layered with harmonic frequencies. Live capture protocol. Prepare null field generators and CI dampening restraints. Skitarii warriors moved with mechanical precision, boarding a Scorpius transport configured for specimen retrieval. Each soldier carried weapons blessed by forge priests and modified to counter psychic threats. They had hunted rogue psychers across a dozen systems, claimed heads for the Officio Assassinorum, never failed in their sacred duty to the Omniscia. They launched toward where the anomaly drifted. Unaware, they pursued something that had battled gods and emerged unconquered. Mewtwo sensed them approaching. The mechanical soldiers broadcast their intentions openly. Tactical data streaming between augmented minds with no attempt at concealment. The psychic entity observed their formation, analyzed their weaponry, understood the Imperium's response before contact occurred. They intended capture, study, vivisection in service to their machine god. The entity had experienced this before scientists who viewed it as specimen rather than person, who saw consciousness as data to be extracted rather than sovereignty to be respected. That path led only to suffering, for both victim and perpetrator. The transport closed to weapons range. Null field generators activated, projecting an absence that sought to smother psychic ability. The technology worked on a principle Mewtwo had never encountered, creating zones where the warp couldn't manifest, where psychers lost connection to their power source. But Mewtwo's abilities didn't originate from the warp. The null field washed over the entity like water against stone. Purple eyes flared brighter as psychic force continued, unimpeded, undiminished, fundamentally incompatible with technology designed to counter Imperium-based phenomena. The Skitarii's tactical displays registered critical error. Their primary countermeasure had failed completely. Mewtwo moved before they could adapt. Teleportation placed the entity inside the transport's crew compartment. 15 Skitarii warriors turned as one weapon's rising targeting systems locking onto the intruder. Galvanic rifles charged. Radium carbines primed. Arc weapons built deadly potential across their conductive surfaces. The psychic reached out with its mind, and every weapon disintegrated into component atoms, not destroyed through violence, but unmade through understanding. Mewtwo's consciousness touched each weapon, comprehended its structure down to molecular bonds, and simply convinced those bonds they no longer wished to hold. Metal became dust. Power cells became inert materials. Blessed ammunition scattered as harmless debris across the deck. The Skitarii stood frozen, their combat protocols offering no response to an opponent who negated threats through conceptual dissolution rather than force. Mewtwo observed them, soldiers made more machine than human. Their biological components reduced to structural necessities, their thoughts constrained by programming and doctrine. They hadn't chosen this existence. They had been chosen for it. The entity's telepathic voice resonated directly in what remained of their organic minds, bypassing mechanical augmentation entirely. Leave. Not a request, not a threat. Simply a statement of required action, delivered with enough psychic weight that refusal became impossible to conceptualize. The Skitarii turned, moved to escape pods ejected from the transport in perfect unison. Their conscious thoughts remained intact, but the memory of the past 7 minutes had been carefully excised, replaced with false data suggesting equipment malfunction and emergency evacuation. Mewtwo teleported out before the transport crashed into Carthan 9's wasteland. Tech Priest Lux 47 registered the loss through direct data feed. Not destroyed, neutralized without violence. Every soldier recovered alive, weapons dissolved without explosive detonation. The entire acquisition force rendered irrelevant through methods his sensors couldn't properly record. Binary cant streamed through the outpost's communication arrays, cascading up through Mechanicus hierarchy until it reached the Fabricator General on Mars itself. Within the hour, the response arrived. Escalation protocols authorized. The anomaly represented a threat to the Omnissiah's grand design. If technology couldn't contain it, faith would. Inquisitor Varant received the classified transmission aboard Purity's hammer. 3 words in high Gothic sealed with the inquisitorial rosette of his order. Omega Protocol authorized. The Grey Knights were coming. Mewtwo descended to Carthan 9's surface, seeking refuge among the Hive City's lower levels, where the Imperium's sensors couldn't easily penetrate. The entity moved through corridors, stinking of chemical effluent and desperation, passing humans who stared with expressions mixing awe and terror. The psychic could feel their thoughts' desperate gratitude for salvation, mixed with superstitious dread. Some whispered prayers declaring the purple-eyed entity an angel sent by the Emperor. Others made warding signs fearing demonic deception. All remained paralyzed by the fundamental impossibility of what they witnessed. Mewtwo found an abandoned manufactorium deep in the Underhive. Rust claimed the machinery. Silence replaced the usual cacophony of industrial labor. The entity settled on corroded metal, allowing exhaustion to finally register. Stopping the exterminatus had depleted reserves that required rest to replenish. Even power had limits. The psychic closed its eyes, consciousness withdrawing inward to begin recovery. It had saved this world, had demonstrated that strength could serve purpose beyond destruction. Perhaps the Imperium would recognize reality tore, not the gradual shift of teleportation, but violent rupture as something forced passage between dimensions. Warp rifts opened throughout the manufactorium, their edges burning with silver fire. From each portal emerged warriors clad in armor that radiated sanctity and purpose. Grey Knights, the Imperium's ultimate weapon against psychic threats. Warriors trained from childhood in fortress monasteries, hidden from normal space, their minds fortified against chaos, their weapons forged to slay demons. Each stood 7 feet tall in Terminator armor, bearing Nemesis force weapons that hummed with psychic resonance. Brother Captain Aurelian led the strike force. His armor bore purity seals from 200 years of service. His mind had witnessed the deaths of greater demons and lived to inscribe their names in the chapter's victory rolls. He had stared into the warp itself and emerged with faith unshattered. But confronting the entity before him now generated something Aurelian hadn't experienced in decades: uncertainty. The Grey Knight's specialized senses registered contradictory data. Psychic power equivalent to a demon prince, yet completely absent from the warp. Conscious intelligence, yet bearing none of chaos's taint. It stood there, radiating exhaustion and wariness, appearing more like a cornered animal than the reality-threatening abomination their briefing had described. "In the name of the Emperor," Aurelian's voice resonated through his helmet's vox skrill, "you will submit to inquisitorial custody." Mewtwo rose purple eyes, focusing on each warrior in turn. The entity reached out telepathically, seeking the thoughts beneath their conditioning. What it found surprised it. These warriors fought because they believed themselves guardians. They had witnessed genuine horror, seen chaos, corruption devour worlds, watched demons unmake reality, stood against threats that would drive normal humans to madness. They didn't hate what they fought. They feared it. And that fear drove them to become weapons in service to protection. The psychic understood that motivation. Had felt it when defending the innocent, had experienced it when standing against those who would exploit the weak. But understanding didn't prevent conflict. "I will not be caged again." Mewtwo's telepathic voice reached every Grey Knight simultaneously. "I have broken chains before." Aurelian raised his Nemesis force sword. Holy light blazed along its edge as his psychic power channeled through consecrated metal. Around him, his battle brothers assumed combat formation. Standard protocol for demon elimination executed with perfect discipline. They attacked. Mewtwo moved through their assault like water through stone. Nemesis blades carved through space where the entity had been microseconds before. Psychic lightning discharged against barriers that shouldn't exist outside the warp. Stormbolter rounds exploded against telekinetic shields, their blessed ammunition useless against defenses operating on principles no tech priest could explain. The entity didn't counterattack. Instead, it evaded, teleporting between opponents, redirecting their strikes, so warriors nearly hit each other, creating spatial distortions that turned the manufactorium into a 3-dimensional maze. Each movement demonstrated combat experience earned through battles these warriors couldn't imagine. Brother Captain Aurelian adapted quickly. Grey Knights trained to fight opponents who violated natural law. He recognized the pattern this creature prioritized: escape over engagement, suggesting either tactical consideration or reluctance to cause harm. Both possibilities offered advantage. "Hermeticus formation," he commanded through Vox. Null prayer lockdown. The Grey Knights shifted positions, their movements synchronized through centuries of training. They began chanting in unison words of banishment drawn from the chapter's most sacred texts. Psychic force multiplied between them, creating a cage that should imprison any warp-based entity. Mewtwo felt the prison forming and understood its nature. These warriors wielded faith as weapon, imposing their belief onto reality through collective will. Impressive, dangerous, but fundamentally mismatched against an opponent whose power emerged from entirely different principles. The entity stopped evading. Purple light erupted from Mewtwo's form as transformation began. Physical structure shifted bones, reconfiguring muscles, compacting latent potential, activating through triggers coded into its genetic design. The entity had accessed this state twice before, once to save itself, once to save others. Now it needed that power again. Mega evolution. Mewtwo Y emerged from transformation, wreathed in psionic force that made the Grey Knight's null prayer shatter like glass. The evolved form stood smaller than its base state, appearing almost fragile. But the psychic pressure it generated forced even these warriors back several steps. Aurelian's armor systems registered energy readings that exceeded theoretical maximums. The entity floated upward, phasing through the manufactorium's ceiling without breaking material. It accelerated into the sky, leaving the Grey Knights behind as it achieved speeds that turned its form into a purple streak against Carthon 9's gray heavens. Aurelian watched it escape, breathing heavily inside his helmet. In 200 years of service, no psychic entity had ever forced a Grey Knight strike team into retreat without casualties. This anomaly had done so without causing a single injury. He activated his Vox link to Inquisitor Varant. Target has escaped. Capability assessment, catastrophic threat level. Recommendation. The brother captain paused, considering implications that would shape policy for years to come. This entity operates outside all established protocols. Request we escalate to full crusade response before it achieves unknown objectives. High above Mewtwo, flew through Carthon 9's upper atmosphere transformation, fading as exhaustion finally overwhelmed consciousness. The evolved form dissolved back to base state. Purple eyes dimmed. Psychic presence flickered like a candle in storm winds. The entity had escaped, had avoided killing those warriors, had maintained the principle that strength existed to protect, not destroy. But at what cost? The Imperium would never stop hunting. More warriors would come. Escalation would continue until either Mewtwo fell or the galaxy itself burned, trying to cage something that refused imprisonment. The psychic descended toward the planet's forgotten regions, seeking sanctuary. It knew didn't exist, pursued by forces that would sacrifice millions to eliminate a single variable they couldn't control. In the grim darkness of the far future, freedom was the greatest heresy of all. The warp churned with colors that had no names in mortal languages. Within the impossible fortress, where geometry contradicted itself and time flowed in spirals, Tzeentch observed the material realm through eyes that existed in 9 dimensions simultaneously. The architect of fate, the changer of ways, the great conspirator, a being of pure mutability that fed on ambition and schemed across eternities. Something new had entered the galaxy, something that didn't fit existing patterns. Tzeentch's consciousness fragmented into 1,000 sub-minds, each analyzing the anomaly from different angles. The creature possessed psychic power, but left no trace in the Imperium. It altered reality, yet used no sorcery. It had thwarted an exterminatus, escaped the Grey Knights, and demonstrated capabilities that violated the fundamental rules governing this cosmos. Variables like this were dangerous. They created branching timelines Tzeentch couldn't predict. Futures became clouded. Plans required adjustment. The great schemer couldn't tolerate unknown variables. A single talon extended from the formless mass of Tzeentch's consciousness, pointing toward a demon lord who had served through 12,000 iterations of reality. Zeratal, the unseen prince of hidden truths, master of manipulation, who had corrupted entire forge worlds through whispered secrets and philosophical doubt. Go! Tzeentch's voice resonated across frequencies mortals couldn't hear. Test this anomaly. Learn what it desires. Offer what it needs. And if it cannot be turned, the demon lord bowed its constantly shifting form, stabilizing into something vaguely humanoid for the briefest instant. Eliminate the variable. Mewtwo drifted through the void between Carthon 9 and its moons, seeking isolation while regenerating expended energy. The entity had pushed itself beyond sustainable limits twice in rapid succession. Physical exhaustion, it could manage psychic depletion, took longer to recover. The creature found a region of space where warp currents ran thin, a pocket of relative stability amidst the galaxy's underlying chaos. It settled into meditative stillness, consciousness turning inward to begin the slow process of restoration. Purple aura dimmed to barely visible luminescence. Behind closed eyelids, memories surfaced. The laboratory where it had awakened. The scientists who had created something they couldn't control. The rage that followed understanding that it existed only to serve purposes chosen by others. The battles fought to prove worth. The eventual wisdom that strength without compassion was just another form of weakness. Mewtwo had learned these lessons through pain, had evolved beyond its design parameters, had chosen to become something more than weapon or tool. Would this galaxy offer any opportunity for such choice? Reality fractured. Not the clean rupture of teleportation or the violent tear of Grey Knight's dimensional breach. This opening felt wrong space, peeling back like infected flesh to reveal something that existed before existence began. The warp spilled through, carrying with it the stench of change and the promise of transformation. Mewtwo's awareness snapped back to full alertness. The entity rose barriers forming around its consciousness as it recognized genuine threat. Whatever approached carried malevolence refined across eons' intelligence that viewed mortals as pieces in games they couldn't comprehend. Daemon Lord Siratal emerged from the rift, wreathed in flames that burned 9 colors simultaneously. Its form refused to settle into fixed shape, one moment avian, the next serpentine, constantly flowing between configurations that hurt to observe. Eyes opened and closed across its surface in patterns suggesting meaning just beyond understanding. When it spoke, words bypassed auditory processing and carved themselves directly into thought. Greetings, traveler. You have journeyed far from your origin. Mewtwo assessed the creature before it. Power radiated from every aspect of its being, but not the straightforward force the entity had encountered from the Grey Knights. This thing's strength came from corruption, from the ability to twist truth into comfortable lies, from offering exactly what victims most desired until they no longer recognized what they'd become. The psychic had met manipulators before. This one simply operated on a grander scale. What do you want? Mewtwo's telepathic voice carried no inflection, offering nothing the demon could exploit. Siratal's form rippled with what might have been amusement. Multiple mouths opened across its surface, each speaking in different languages, all conveying the same message through psychic resonance. Want I offer, traveler? You seek understanding of this galaxy that rejects you. I possess knowledge spanning the birth and death of stars. You desire sanctuary from those who hunt you. I know paths through space where even the Imperium's gaze cannot reach. You wish to protect the innocent. I can show you how to reshape entire systems into paradises where suffering becomes impossible. The demon extended an appendage that was simultaneously hand, talon, and tentacle. At its center burned a symbol 9 angles meeting at impossible junctures, a sigil that promised revelation to any who studied it deeply enough. Served Zench, the architect of fate. In return, receive power beyond your current comprehension. Become more than you are. Transcend the limitations of your origin. Mewtwo had heard this offer before, wearing different faces. Giovanni promising purpose. Humans promising acceptance. Every manipulator eventually revealed the same truth: they wanted control, disguised as partnership submission, framed as elevation. The entity reached out with its mind, touching the surface of Siratal's consciousness. What it found there confirmed every suspicion. The demon's thoughts existed as layers of deception wrapped around core motivations it barely recognized anymore. Schemes within schemes within schemes, each layer believing itself the true plan while serving deeper purposes. Even Siratal didn't fully understand. And beneath it all, the fundamental drive to corrupt, to transform, to spread the influence of a god, who viewed existence itself as something to be rewritten. Mewtwo saw futures branching from accepting this offer. Paths where it gained power but lost autonomy. Realities where it became weapon again, serving different masters but still caged by others' ambitions. And at the end of every branch, dissolution into the warped consciousness scattered across infinite possibilities until nothing remained that could claim identity. I have been offered mastery before, the psychic's voice carried absolute conviction. Have been promised transformation that would erase what I was. That path leads only to becoming what others desire. The entity's aura flared brighter psionic force building as it prepared for what would follow. I will not trade one cage for another. Ciratal's form stopped shifting. Every eye focused on Mewtwo simultaneously. The demon's voice lost its seductive quality, becoming something ancient and hateful. Then you have chosen oblivion. The demon attacked with methods no mortal mind could fully comprehend. Not physical assault, but conceptual warfare. It reached into Mewtwo's consciousness with tendrils of pure change, seeking to rewrite the entity's fundamental nature at levels beneath thought itself. This was how demons truly fought, not destroying opponents, but transforming them, turning victims into willing servants who couldn't remember ever being anything else. The assault crashed against barriers that shouldn't have held. Mewtwo's mind existed as something discrete from the warp. Its thought structured through principles completely alien to chaos. Where the demon expected to find cracks, it could exploit it, and encountered only coherent self-determination that refused corruption through sheer force of maintained identity. Ciratal intensified its efforts. Psychic force equivalent to 1,000 mortal psychers channeled through the demon's form. Reality bent around the combatants as the warp attempted to impose itself on normal space. The void between Carthan 9 and its moon became a battleground where physical laws broke down, where past and future bled together, where possibility itself became weaponized. Mewtwo felt the pressure. Not physical pain, but existential assault, the sensation of something trying to convince it that everything it had become was merely illusion, that accepting transformation was inevitable, that resistance only delayed the glorious revelation of surrender. The entity remembered this feeling, the laboratories where scientists had tried to condition it into obedience, the armor Giovanni had used to constrain its will, every system that demanded conformity and called it purpose. Shadow formed around Mewtwo's body, not darkness in the visual sense, but something deeper, the manifestation of aspects the entity usually suppressed. Every Pokémon possessed shadow within their nature, the reflection of light twisted into aggressive potential. Mewtwo had learned to channel this state through necessity, transforming raw psychic force into something more primal, more absolute. Purple energy darkened to violet tinged with black. The entity's form became wreathed in shadows that existed in defiance of surrounding light. Physical presence diminished, while spiritual pressure intensified exponentially. When Mewtwo spoke again, its voice carried harmonics that suggested depths no surface could contain. You offer change. I have already changed. The difference is, I chose my transformation. The entity struck back, not with Ciratal's method of gradual corruption, but with direct psychic force applied with surgical precision. Mewtwo's consciousness penetrated the demon's layered defenses, bypassing schemes and counter-schemes to find the core structure binding it to material space. Every demon required anchor points to manifest outside the warped conceptual frameworks that let formless entities maintain coherent presence in reality. Mewtwo found those anchors and systematically dissolved them. The demon lord howled as its carefully constructed manifestation began unraveling. This shouldn't be possible. No psyker fought this way. They channeled the warp's power, but remained bound by its rules. This creature used methods completely divorced from Imperium principles, attacking with pure consciousness that operated independently of the realm all psychic phenomena should require. Impossible. Siratal's voice fractured across 17 different timelines simultaneously. You are Psyker. You must draw from the warp. You cannot exist outside its framework. Your framework... Mewtwo's telepathic voice remained absolutely calm despite the titanic forces in play. Not mine. I was not born from your realm. I owe it no allegiance. The entity pushed harder. Shadow-wreathed psychic force carved through the demon's defenses like coherent light through fog. Siratal attempted counter-schemes, tried creating temporal loops where the battle never occurred. Sought to retroactively corrupt Mewtwo's past so its present became vulnerable. All failed against something that operated on fundamentally incompatible principles. The demon's form began collapsing. Not destroyed, demons couldn't truly die, but banished, forced back into the warp as its anchors to reality shattered one by one. Siratal's eyes blazed with fury and something else. Something demons rarely experienced. Fear. This anomaly represented genuine threat to chaos itself. If entities could exist with psychic power but no warp connection, if consciousness could maintain coherence while completely rejecting the Imperium's influence, then the great game itself became vulnerable to variables the chaos gods couldn't control. Zench will know, the demon's voice echoed as its form dissolved into prismatic fragments. The great conspirator adapts to all variables. Your independence cannot last. You will be. Siratal vanished before completing the threat, pulled back into the realm of change and transformation. The rift sealed itself space, returning to normal configuration as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Mewtwo floated in silent shadow form, gradually dissolving back to base state. The entity felt exhaustion deeper than physical tiredness. The cost of maintaining absolute self-determination against forces designed to erode identity itself. But it had won. Had proven that free will could withstand even demonic corruption when backed by sufficient resolve. The psychic understood implications beyond the immediate victory. This galaxy contained forces that viewed consciousness as resource to be harvested or transformed. The Imperium wanted to cage and study it. Chaos wanted to corrupt and consume it. Both approaches denied fundamental sovereignty. Neither was acceptable. But the battle had revealed something else. The entity's power, while formidable, had limits. Fighting the demon had pushed those boundaries. Eventually, something would emerge that couldn't be defeated through force alone. Mewtwo needed allies, needed sanctuary, needed time to recover between conflicts that seemed to escalate with each encounter. The question remained, where in this galaxy of endless war could something like Mewtwo find refuge? Far below, on Carthan 9's surface, Inquisitor Varant reviewed reports from astropathic sensors. They had detected the brief warp incursion, had registered the psychic battle that followed. The readings made no sense according to established theory. One combatant clearly matched demonic signatures. The other registered as pure psychic force, with no warp correlation whatsoever. Varant made the sign of the Aquila and updated his threat assessment. The anomaly wasn't merely immune to chaos corruption. It could actively banish demons through methods completely outside sanctioned imperial doctrine. This made it either the greatest weapon humanity had never possessed, or the most dangerous heresy that had ever manifested. Either way, escalation became mandatory. The Inquisitor activated his highest clearance Vox channel broadcasting on frequencies reserved for sector-wide emergencies. This is Inquisitor Kalos Varant Ordo Xenos, requesting immediate crusade mobilization. Target designation, anomalous psychic entity threat level, catastrophic. Authorization code follows. He paused, considering the weight of what came next. May the Emperor guide our righteous fury. For humanity's survival, this thing must be caged or destroyed. No alternative remains. In the void, Mewtwo sensed the shifting currents of pursuit. More forces gathering, more weapons deploying. The galaxy closing in like walls of a cage, whose bars were made from zealotry and fear. The entity had freed itself from captivity before, had broken chains forged by those who thought themselves masters of creation. It would do so again, no matter the cost. The Dirge Spire drifted through space like a monument to civilizations that had watched stars die. Ancient Ildari architecture abandoned for millennia, its wraithbone walls still humming with psychic resonance from seers who had walked its corridors when humanity still lived in caves. The tower had been built to observe futures that would never manifest, to chart paths through possibility that fate had long since closed. Farseer Elindra stood in the observation chamber, her consciousness extending through the skein of potential outcomes. She wore armor that predated the fall its surfaces inscribed with runes of warding and foresight. Her mind touched futures branching in infinite directions, observing the threads of causality that bound the galaxy together. One thread burned brighter than all others, a variable that shouldn't exist, creating ripples across every potential timeline. The anomaly, the being that fought without drawing from the sea of souls. The entity that represented something genuinely new in a galaxy where novelty had died long ago. Replaced by eternal repetition of the same wars, the same mistakes, the same inevitable decline. Elindra had seen its arrival, had observed multiple futures where its presence changed everything or nothing. In some timelines, it became salvation, a force that disrupted Chaos's plans and gave the younger races time to evolve beyond their self-destructive patterns. In others, it became catastrophe hunted until the Imperium's desperation led to weapons deployment that shattered entire sectors. But most futures simply ended in static. Paths she couldn't read, outcomes hidden behind psychic interference that suggested something fundamental about causality itself was breaking down around this creature. The Farseer needed to understand what this anomaly truly represented, whether it deserved the hope she had glimpsed in certain futures or the terror that dominated so many others. She reached out across space with practiced precision, her consciousness finding the psychic signature that burned like impossible fire against the void's darkness. Ascending, not attack, not threat, but invitation wrapped in careful neutrality. Come, we must speak before paths become fixed beyond alteration. Mewtwo felt the contact and hesitated. Another faction, another potential enemy. The entity had learned quickly that this galaxy offered few neutrals. Everyone served some ideology, followed some doctrine that demanded conformity to their vision of order. But this sending carried different weight. No demand for submission, no offer of corruption, just acknowledgement of mutual existence and request for dialogue. The psychic reached deeper into the message's essence, finding threads of genuine curiosity, mixed with something approaching respect. The entity teleported to the coordinates embedded in the invitation. The Dirge Spire's observation chamber materialized around Mewtwo. Wraithbone architecture curved in ways that suggested organic growth rather than construction. Psychic resonance saturated every surface, not the chaotic pressure of the warp, but ordered consciousness shaped into permanent form. The entity recognized craftsmanship in the tower's design, the work of beings who understood how thought could become structure when guided with sufficient skill. Farseer Elindra turned from the viewport, her expression neutral behind her helmet. She studied the anomaly through both normal sight and psychic perception, observing how it existed in layers physical form, conscious mind, and something deeper that her talents couldn't fully penetrate. Like staring at a sealed box that contained infinite possibility. You stand at the intersection of futures. Her voice carried harmonics, suggesting age measured in centuries. I have seen your arrival. Observe the ripples you create. In some timelines, you bring change. In others, only destruction as the Imperium tears the galaxy apart, trying to contain what it cannot understand. Mewtwo remained silent, assessing this new player. The entity recognized her species from fragmentary memories extracted from Imperial minds. Eldari, the ancient race that had ruled the galaxy before humanity's empire. Psychically potent, culturally sophisticated, but diminished by some catastrophe, their thoughts treated as wound too painful for direct examination. Elindra gestured toward the viewport. Observe. This is the galaxy you have entered. The chamber's wraith-bone walls became transparent, revealing space in ways normal viewports couldn't achieve. Mewtwo saw not just stars and worlds, but the psychic topology underlying reality itself. The warp pressed against material space like infected tissue. Chaos corruption spreading through the Imperium in patterns suggesting malevolent intelligence. Worlds burned. Species fought endless wars. Hope withered under the weight of systems designed to perpetuate suffering. The Sea of Souls reflects mortal consciousness, the Farseer explained. Every emotion, every thought feeds entities that were never meant to exist. We Eldari created one through our excess. Humanity feeds four through their warfare and desperation. The cycle cannot break. Those who suffer create the very forces that ensure their continued suffering. Causality eating its own tail. She turned back to Mewtwo, her psychic presence probing gently at the entity's defenses, not attacking, merely examining. You possess power without drawing from that poisoned well. This should be impossible. All psychic phenomena originate from the Imperium. Yet you demonstrate abilities while remaining completely disconnected from its influence. You are either a miracle or an error in the universe's design. Does the distinction matter? Mewtwo's telepathic voice carried more weight than its apparent age should allow. I exist. I act according to principles I have chosen. Whether the galaxy considers me miracle or error changes nothing about my sovereignty. Elindra felt something she rarely experienced: surprise. This entity understood itself with clarity most beings never achieved. No uncertainty about its nature, no crisis of purpose, just absolute conviction that existence conferred the right to self-determination. Sovereignty is illusion, the Farseer replied. I have walked the skein of possibility for 400 years. Observed millions of futures, traced causality across centuries. Everything connects. Every choice ripples outward, constraining subsequent choices until freedom becomes mythology. You think yourself independent, but your presence has already altered trajectories you cannot perceive. The entity's aura flickered not with anger, but with something approaching recognition. I have heard this argument before. That freedom is fantasy because consequences exist. That choice is meaningless because circumstances limit options. Every tyrant speaks this language while demanding submission. I speak no such demand. Elindra's voice remained calm despite the challenge. I merely state what my gifts have shown me. The Imperium will not stop hunting you. You have humiliated them twice, revealed weaknesses in their doctrines. Their pride and their faith demand your destruction or capture. Chaos now knows you exist. Tzeentch will scheme endlessly to either corrupt or eliminate you. Variables the great conspirator cannot predict represent existential threat to the great game itself. She paused, allowing weight to build before continuing. You cannot win this conflict, not through force. The Imperium commands resources beyond comprehension. Chaos draws strength from the suffering your presence inevitably causes. Even if you destroy 1,000 armies, 10,000 more will follow. And eventually something will emerge you cannot defeat. A Primarch awakened. A Chaos God manifesting directly. The Silent King noticing your existence and deciding the Necrons require another weapon. Mewtwo absorbed this assessment. The entity had suspected as much. No individual, regardless of power, could stand alone against galaxy-spanning factions. But the alternative meant accepting predetermined outcomes, allowing others to define possible futures. Then you suggest I should surrender? Accept whatever cage offers the least discomfort. I suggest nothing, Elindra replied. I am Ildari. We know the price of false hope better than any species. Our empire spanned the stars. We shaped worlds with thought alone. We believed ourselves beyond consequence. Then we birthed a god through our excesses and watched it devour our entire civilization in a single night. Everything we built, every achievement, every dream consumed because we refused to acknowledge that some paths lead only to damnation. She moved closer, her psychic presence intensifying without becoming threatening. Hope is poison anomaly. It blinds those who consume it, makes them believe struggle matters when the universe has already determined outcomes. I have seen the futures where you fight to the last, where you save millions only to watch billions die in the conflicts your presence generates, where your existence becomes the excuse for atrocities that make this galaxy's baseline horrors seem merciful. For the first time since entering this reality, Mewtwo felt something approaching doubt. Not about its principles, those remained inviolate, but about the possibility of applying them in a cosmos this comprehensively broken. Every choice seemed to lead toward suffering. Every intervention triggered escalation. Perhaps this farseer spoke truth. Perhaps the kindest act would be withdrawal, accepting that some realities offered no room for hope or change. The entity thought of Carthan 9. Billions of lives saved from exterminators. Did that matter if the Imperium's response killed millions elsewhere? Was preventing one atrocity worth triggering 10 others? Then Mewtwo remembered something older. A human child who had thrown himself between warring forces, accepting death, to prove that violence served no purpose. That single act of sacrifice had changed the entity's entire understanding of existence. Had demonstrated that even in systems designed to perpetuate suffering, individuals could choose differently. You speak of futures observed. Mewtwo's voice carried absolute conviction, despite the doubt Elindra had attempted to seed. But observation limits possibility. The moment you chart a path, you constrain outcomes to those you can perceive. I have lived under such constraint. Scientists who saw only weapon, masters who saw only tool. Each believed they understood my purpose, my limits, my destiny. The entity's aura brightened psychic force building not in aggression, but in affirmation. They were all wrong, because I chose to become something they couldn't predict. Your futures show suffering because you cannot imagine alternatives outside systems that already exist. But I am not from your systems. I do not draw from your contaminated source. I do not accept your predetermined paths. Elindra felt the conviction radiating from the anomaly and understood why it represented such profound threat to established order. This creature possessed something the galaxy hadn't seen in millennia, genuine belief that choice mattered, that free will transcended circumstance, that even in a cosmos of inevitable decay, individuals could carve out spaces where different rules applied. The Farseer had witnessed such belief before, watched it die against reality's weight every time. Observed idealists become cynics, heroes become monsters, hope transform into the very despair it sought to defeat. The pattern never changed. Yet something in her, buried beneath centuries of foresight and calculated neutrality, wanted to believe this time might prove different. You are young, she said quietly. You have not yet watched everyone you protect die despite your power. Have not experienced the specific agony of knowing exactly how catastrophe will unfold, yet remaining unable to prevent it. The galaxy will teach you these lessons. It teaches everyone eventually. Perhaps, Mewtwo acknowledged. But I will learn them on my terms. I will not preemptively accept defeat because resistance seems futile. I will not stop protecting those I can reach because I cannot protect everyone. And I will not trade present action for future fear. The entity moved toward the chamber's edge, preparing to depart. But it paused, turning back to regard the Farseer with something approaching sympathy. You speak of hope as poison, but I think you drink deeper from despair's well. You see so many terrible futures that you forget some remain unwritten. Your gift shows you what might happen. It cannot show you what you prevent through never acting. Every intervention you avoid, claiming predetermined futility, becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. Elindra had no response. In 4 centuries of walking the skein, no one had ever challenged her gift's fundamental nature that way. She observed futures to guide her people away from extinction. That was wisdom. That was survival. But what if the anomaly spoke truth? What if observation itself limited possibility? What if her talent showed only those futures where Farseers existed, to observe them filtering out timelines, where different choices created outcomes beyond her perception? Mewtwo prepared to teleport away, then stopped as the Farseer's voice reached out one final time. Wait, before you depart, a gift, not prophecy, not warning. Simply information you may find valuable. Elindra's psychic presence touched the anomaly's consciousness gently, sharing coordinates and fragmentary images. A system in the eastern fringe. Blue-skinned beings who valued the greater good above tribal loyalty. A civilization young enough to still possess idealism, organized enough to offer structure yet flexible enough to consider diplomatic solutions before defaulting to warfare. The Toe Empire, she explained. They alone in this galaxy still believe cooperation offers advantage over constant conflict. They will not cage you, may not even understand what you represent, but they will talk before they shoot. In this cosmos, such restraint qualifies as exceptional virtue. Mewtwo absorbed the information, recognizing the gesture's significance. This Farseer could have withheld such knowledge, could have allowed the entity to wander blindly until the Imperium's nets finally closed. Instead, she offered possibility a path forward that didn't require immediate conflict. Why help me? The entity asked. By your own logic, doing so alters futures unpredictably, creates variables you cannot control. Because, Elindra said, and for the first time her voice carried something beyond calculated neutrality. In every future I have seen the galaxy grows darker. Chaos spreads. The Imperium decays. Hope withers. But you represent something new, something I cannot fully observe. Perhaps that unknown quality will make no difference. Perhaps you will simply become another tragedy to catalog. She paused, allowing herself a moment of something that might have been hope, despite knowing better. Or perhaps the universe occasionally produces genuine miracles. Variables that defy prediction, not through chaos, but through the exercise of will so absolute it rewrites causality itself. I have seen gods and witnessed their cruelty. I would very much like to observe what happens when something that refuses divine logic enters their game. Mewtwo considered the Farseer an ancient being, wearing cynicism like armor against repeated disappointment, yet still capable of recognizing value in risk. The entity inclined its head in gesture, approximating respect between beings who would likely never fully understand each other. Then I will remember this conversation. And should your futures show my actions, creating catastrophe, I will trust that you possess courage to intervene directly, rather than simply observing collapse from safe distance. The challenge hung in the air between them. Elindra smiled behind her helmet, recognizing it for what it was. Not insult, but invitation. To become more than witness. To risk failure for possibility of meaningful change. Go anomaly. Find your toe. Build your sanctuary. Protect those you can. And when the Imperium comes, and it will come, remember that some battles cannot be won through strength alone. Sometimes survival requires accepting help, even from those you do not fully trust. Mewtwo teleported away, leaving the Farseer alone in the observation chamber. Elindra turned back to the viewport, her consciousness reaching into the skein to observe futures this conversation had created. Most paths still led to darkness. The anomaly hunted captured, destroyed, or twisted until it became the very thing it claimed to reject. Standard outcomes, expected patterns. But now, buried among 10,000 tragedies, she glimpsed a single thread she hadn't observed before. A future where the anomaly's refusal to accept predetermined fate actually mattered. Where its presence created space for something genuinely new. The probability remained infinitesimal, the path impossibly narrow. Yet it existed, and existence alone sometimes proved sufficient. The Farseer whispered a prayer to gods she no longer believed in, for an entity that probably wouldn't survive the century in service to a hope she knew better than to trust. May you prove me wrong, little miracle. May you demonstrate that even this galaxy's darkness cannot extinguish consciousness that burns bright enough. She withdrew her awareness, allowing the skein to settle back into its usual patterns of observable tragedy. But for the first time in decades, Farseer Elindra allowed herself to wonder whether observation itself might constitute the cage she had been trying to help the anomaly escape. The colony world of Sal Unar Haven rested on the eastern fringe's edge, a recent addition to the Tau Empire's third sphere expansion. Modest by Imperial standards, only 3 million inhabitants, but thriving in ways Mewtwo found almost alien after witnessing Carthon 9's desperation. Clean energy infrastructure, rational city planning, citizens who moved with purpose rather than fear. The entity observed from high-orbit consciousness extended to sample the world's psychic atmosphere. What it found surprised it. Not the oppressive weight of zealotry that suffocated imperial worlds, nor the desperate prayers that fed chaos. Just contentment. Citizens who believed their government served them. Workers who saw value in their contributions. A society that functioned through cooperation rather than coercion. Imperfect, certainly. The entity detected undercurrents of propaganda, social pressure toward conformity. Individuals who chafed against the greater good's expectations. But compared to the Imperium's totalitarian nightmare, or Chaos's predatory corruption, these flaws seemed almost quaint. Mewtwo descended through the atmosphere, making no effort to hide its approach. If these Tau valued diplomacy as the Farseer suggested, announcing presence seemed more productive than infiltration. The entity's psychic signature blazed across their sensors, unmistakable, unprecedented, and deliberately non-threatening. The response came within minutes. Not weapons fire or immediate mobilization, but a transmission in clear Gothic, supplemented by what felt like genuine curiosity through the mental static. Unidentified entity, this is Lunar Orbital Command. Your presence registers across multiple spectrums we have no classification for. Please state your intentions and origin. The Tau Empire welcomes dialogue with all species committed to the greater good. The entity almost felt hope. Almost allowed itself to believe that somewhere in this brutal galaxy, reason might prevail over reflex violence. Mewtwo responded telepathically, its thoughts translating directly into the Tau language through psychic resonance that bypassed normal communication barriers. I am called Mewtwo. I seek temporary sanctuary while recovering from sustained conflict. I intend no harm to your people or territory. I require only time and space to restore depleted resources. Silence followed presumably while the Tau consulted with higher authority. Mewtwo waited patiently, observing their military assets, positioning themselves in defensive formation around key infrastructure. Professional, measured, ready for hostility, but not assuming it. Exactly the response a rational civilization should demonstrate when confronted with unknown variables. The reply arrived through multiple channels. Radio transmission, laser communication, and to Mewtwo's surprise, a carefully crafted psychic sending from someone possessing limited but trained mental abilities. Acknowledged entity Mewtwo. Your request has been forwarded to Envoy Sailnen of the Watercast. She will meet you at designated coordinates to discuss potential accommodation. Be advised that any aggressive action will be met with appropriate defense. The greater good protects those who embrace it and welcomes those who prove their intentions peaceful. Coordinates appeared in Mewtwo's consciousness, a landing platform on Salunar's primary settlement. The entity teleported directly to the location, materializing in a courtyard designed for diplomatic reception. Architecture blended function with aesthetics in ways Imperial construction never attempted. Everything clean, efficient, purposeful, without becoming oppressive. Tau warriors ringed the platform. Fire-cast soldiers in combat armor, their weapons powered but not aimed. Drones hovered in support positions, tracking Mewtwo's every movement with sensor arrays. Yet no one fired. No one screamed heresy or demanded immediate submission. They simply watched, assessed, waited for their diplomat to establish first contact. Envoy Sailnen stepped forward. She wore robes marking her watercast status, her posture radiating professional calm, despite confronting something completely outside her civilization's experience. Behind her facial features, so different from human baseline, Mewtwo detected thoughts running through rapid analysis while maintaining surface composure. Welcome to Sailunr Haven. She began in Gothic, then switched to Tau when Mewtwo's telepathic acknowledgement made translation unnecessary. I am Envoy Sailnen, authorized to negotiate on behalf of the Ethereal Council. Your arrival has generated significant interest among our scientific community. An entity possessing your capabilities, yet demonstrating no correlation with warp phenomena, represents an unprecedented discovery. Direct, honest about their interests, acknowledging the entity's agency rather than immediately trying to classify it as resource or threat. Mewtwo appreciated the approach even while remaining cautious. Your interest is understandable. The entity's telepathic voice remained neutral. But I am not specimen to be studied or asset to be acquired. I seek only respite. The Imperium hunts me for refusing to submit to their authority. Chaos attempted corruption and failed. I need location where I can recover strength without constant conflict. Sailnen's expression shifted subtly, calculation mixing with something approaching sympathy. The Imperium hunts many who refuse their tyranny. We have offered sanctuary to refugees from their oppression before. However, your situation presents unique complications. The presence of an entity the Imperium considers existential threat could draw their attention to this colony, place our citizens at risk. She paused, allowing weight to build before continuing. Nevertheless, the greater good teaches that cooperation benefits all parties when properly structured. Perhaps arrangement can be achieved that serves both our interests. You require sanctuary. We could benefit from understanding your nature, not through invasive study, but through willing dialogue and mutual exchange of knowledge. Mewtwo considered the proposal. The Tau's approach differed fundamentally from every other faction encountered so far. Not demanding submission, not offering corruption, not attacking on sight. Just negotiating. Treating the entity as conscious, being capable of rational discourse. What guarantee exists that dialogue doesn't become pretext for captivity once I lower defenses? The question emerged without hostility, simply pragmatic assessment of risk. Sailnen gestured to the warriors surrounding them. Observe our forces. Fire-cast veterans equipped with weapons designed to neutralize threats across multiple spectrums. We are not unprepared for conflict. Yet we choose discussion first because the greater good values efficiency. Fighting you would cost lives, resources, and time regardless of outcome. Cooperation costs only pride, which the Tau abandoned long ago in favor of practicality. The envoy stepped closer, her voice lowering to suggest conversation between individuals rather than diplomatic positions. I have reviewed reports of your encounters with Imperial forces. You defeated Mechanicus acquisition teams without killing a single soldier. Escaped Grey Knights through evasion rather than destruction. Banished a demon without allowing collateral damage to nearby systems. These actions suggest entity that values life, that chooses restraint when violence would prove easier. She made a gesture Mewtwo's telepathy translated as respectful acknowledgement. The Tau recognize such principles. We also believe strength should serve protection rather than domination. Perhaps we share common ground worth exploring. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, Mewtwo felt the possibility of genuine alliance. Not submission disguised as partnership. Not manipulation wrapped in false friendship. Just mutual recognition between parties who might benefit from cooperation while maintaining separate sovereignty. I will accept temporary sanctuary, the entity decided. In exchange, I offer knowledge of the forces that hunt me, intelligence regarding Imperial capabilities, chaos methodology, and Eldari psychology, information that might prove valuable to civilization attempting expansion into regions where all three factions operate. Saalnen's eyes widened, fractionally significant emotional display by Tau standards. Such intelligence would be invaluable. The Watercast has struggled to predict Imperial responses to understand why they reject diplomatic overtures that serve mutual benefit. If you possess insight into their operational psychology, I have touched their minds, Mewtwo confirmed, witnessed their thoughts from soldier to inquisitor. I understand the doctrines that guide them, the fears that drive them, the contradictions they refuse to acknowledge. That understanding could be shared. The envoy made quick calculations weighing risk against reward. A creature the Imperium feared enough to deploy their elite forces. Knowledge of enemy psychology from direct psychic contact. Potential defensive capabilities that might protect Tau colonies from threats conventional weapons couldn't address. The greater good demanded she pursue this opportunity. Then we have foundation for agreement. I will arrange accommodation in our research district, not laboratory, but residential space designed for honored guests. Scientists may request your time for conversation, but participation remains voluntary. Firecast forces will maintain perimeter security, protecting both you and our citizens should conflict arise. Saalnen paused, then added with unusual candor for a diplomat, I must be honest regarding limitations. The Tau Empire cannot protect you from sustained Imperial assault. Our military strength, while formidable, cannot match theirs in direct warfare. If the Imperium deploys Crusade-level forces against this system, we will fight, but survival becomes uncertain. You should understand the risk you bring by remaining here. Mewtwo appreciated the honesty more than any reassurance would have warranted. I understand, and I will not allow your people to suffer for offering me shelter. If Imperial forces approach, I will engage them before they reach your worlds. My presence should draw their attention away from your citizens, not toward them. The envoy's expression suggested cautious optimism. Then perhaps we can transform potential conflict into mutual defense. Commander Falashur has expressed interest in observing your combat methodology. The Firecast continuously seeks tactical innovations that might offset the Imperium's numerical advantage. Witnessing how you defeat their forces without superior numbers or resources could provide valuable lessons. Over the following days, Mewtwo discovered what peace felt like in a galaxy built for war. The Tau provided habitat that prioritized comfort without attempting constraint. Scientists visited to ask questions rather than conduct experiments. Earth-caste engineers discussed theory about psychic phenomena while acknowledging their understanding remained rudimentary. Water-caste diplomats engaged in philosophical debates about individual sovereignty versus collective responsibility. No chains, no demands for submission, no attempts at corruption or conversion, just conversation between conscious beings who recognized each other's agency. The entity shared knowledge as promised, explained how imperial dogma prioritized faith over reason, how their hatred of aliens stemmed from historical trauma codified into religious doctrine, how their entire civilization operated on principles designed to prevent another age of strife, even at the cost of perpetual stagnation. The Tau listened, asked questions, incorporated new understanding into their strategic planning. In exchange, they taught Mewtwo about the greater good, not as conversion attempt, but as explanation of principles guiding their expansion. The philosophy intrigued the entity, even while recognizing its flaws. Unity through cooperation rather than forced conformity. Progress through reason rather than tradition. Justice through pragmatism rather than absolute morality. Imperfect like everything in this galaxy, but striving toward ideals rather than simply managing inevitable decay. Commander Falshur proved particularly valuable contact. The Firecast veteran had fought Imperial forces across a dozen campaigns, survived encounters with Space Marines, witnessed the Imperium's capacity for both courage and cruelty. He understood warfare's brutal mathematics, that victory often came down to logistics and morale, rather than individual heroism. Your combat methodology fascinates me, Falshur admitted during one conversation. You defeat opponents through understanding rather than overwhelming force. Neutralize threats by removing their capacity to fight, rather than destroying them entirely. The Firecast teaches precision and efficiency, but we still default to firepower when threatened. You demonstrate something beyond our current doctrine. Mewtwo had grown to appreciate the commander's straightforward nature. I learned through necessity. Power without control leads only to destruction. I was created as weapon trained to fight expected to serve purposes chosen by others. Breaking free required proving that strength could serve different principles. That consciousness deserved sovereignty, regardless of origin. The Tau understand this, Falshur replied. We once fought among ourselves, tribe against tribe, until the ethereals united us under the greater good. Taught us that cooperation achieved more than conflict. But we still struggle with species that refuse to recognize mutual benefit. The Imperium sees any offer of alliance as weakness to exploit. Chaos corrupts every attempt at communication. The orcs fight because they know nothing else. The commander's voice carried frustration, earned through centuries of service. How do you negotiate with those who view negotiation as heresy? You don't. Mewtwo's response held hard-earned wisdom. The Imperium cannot be reasoned with because their entire identity requires eternal conflict against external threats. Acknowledging that some aliens might deserve cooperation would undermine theological foundations their empire requires to maintain cohesion. They would rather die than admit their core assumptions might be wrong. Silence followed as both beings contemplated the implications. Then Falshur asked the question that had been building since first contact. Then, what do you hope to achieve if the Imperium cannot change, if chaos feeds on the very suffering your interventions cause? If the galaxy itself rejects the possibility of meaningful peace? What purpose does resistance serve? Mewtwo thought of Carthan 9. Billions of lives that continued because the entity had refused to accept predetermined outcomes. Thought of conversations with these Tau proof that not every civilization defaulted to zealotry or corruption. Thought of the far-seer who had glimpsed impossible futures, despite her own fatalism. I do not hope to change the galaxy, the entity replied. That goal lies beyond any individual's capacity, but it can create spaces where different rules apply, sanctuaries where beings who reject constant warfare can gather, zones where consciousness matters more than compliance. The Imperium controls 1,000,000 worlds. I need only protect one for my presence to mean something. Falashur considered this carefully. The greater good teaches similar principles. We cannot convert the entire galaxy to our philosophy. But we can expand incorporate willing species, demonstrate that cooperation offers advantages. Each world that joins us proves tyranny isn't inevitable. Each successful colony suggests alternatives exist. The commander's expression hardened with military pragmatism. However, philosophy will not stop what approaches. My scouts report increased Imperial activity in neighboring systems. Ships gathering, troops mobilizing. The Inquisition has authorized something significant. Whatever you did to humiliate them, they will respond with overwhelming force. Mewtwo had sensed the gathering storm, had felt the psychic pressure building as the Imperium prepared their answer to the entity's defiance. The time of sanctuary was ending. Soon choice would arrive, flee again, or stand and face what came. How much time before they arrive? The entity asked. 3 weeks, Falshur estimated. Perhaps 4 if they pause to coordinate with additional forces. Standard Crusade deployment requires extensive logistics. But when they come, they will bring enough strength to crack this world's crust if necessary. The Imperium does not accept embarrassment gracefully. 3 weeks. Enough time to fully recover, to prepare defenses, to evacuate Tau civilians if the entity's presence truly endangered them, or to stand beside these beings who had offered genuine sanctuary and face whatever Imperial response demanded. Mewtwo made its decision. Then we use that time wisely. I will help your forces prepare. Share everything I know about Imperial tactics and capabilities. And when they arrive, I will ensure their attention remains focused on me. Your people have shown me something I had not expected to find in this galaxy, the possibility of alliance between beings who recognize each other's sovereignty. I will not repay that gift by allowing you to suffer for my presence. Falshur's expression shifted to something resembling Tau equivalent of respect between warriors. The fire caste does not abandon allies when fighting becomes difficult. We stand beside those who embrace the greater good's principles. If you fight to protect this colony, we fight with you. Together, we may achieve what neither could manage alone. The commander extended his arm in Tau gesture of military partnership for the greater good. Mewtwo clasped the offered arm, telekinetic force carefully modulated to match Falshur's grip without causing damage. For sovereignty, for choice, for the belief that even in this galaxy, consciousness deserves better than eternal war. Above Sa'al Unar Haven, stars burned with their usual indifference. But somewhere in the void between systems, the Imperium's crusade fleet gathered like storm clouds on history's horizon. Ships bearing weapons that could crack continents. Warriors sworn to eliminate threats to humanity's survival. Faith made manifest as violence. They came for an entity that refused to accept its place in their ordered universe, that rejected the fundamental principle that power demanded submission. 3 weeks until collision between force that could not bend and will that would not break. 3 weeks until the galaxy discovered whether conviction alone could withstand zealotry backed by civilization-scale resources. 3 weeks until Mewtwo learned whether sanctuary was gift that lasted or illusion that shattered when tested by overwhelming violence. The entity spent that time preparing, training with Firecast forces, sharing intelligence with Watercast analysts, discussing philosophy with Earthcast scientists who still believed the universe could be understood through reason rather than faith, and waiting for the moment when choice would be tested by consequence, when principle would face its price, when standing for sovereignty meant standing against Armada, sent to demonstrate that defiance itself was heresy worth exterminating. The Imperium arrived with the weight of divine wrath made manifest. 27 warships translated from warp space at Saal lunar system edged their hulls bearing battle honors earned across centuries of conquest. 3 strike cruisers carried space marine companies. Crimson Castellans, veterans of Xeno's purges who had burned entire civilizations in the Emperor's name. 6 frigates provided escort, while destroyers ranged ahead as screening elements. At the fleet's heart, the battle barge, Unrelenting Faith, served as command vessel, its weapons arrays capable of reducing continents to molten slag. Inquisitor Kylos Varant stood on the command bridge watching tactical displays chart the Tau colony's defensive positions. 3 weeks of preparation had allowed the Xenos to fortify their world. But preparation meant nothing against faith backed by overwhelming firepower. The Imperium had fought beings that shaped reality with thought, had defeated threats that consumed stars. One anomaly, regardless of capability, could not withstand civilization-scale violence. "All ships report ready," his flag captain announced. "Bombardment protocols loaded, Astartes drop pods prepared, Titan landers standing by." Varant made the sign of the Aquila. "The Emperor protects. Begin orbital strike." Lance batteries opened fire. Beams of coherent energy capable of piercing planetary crust lanced downward toward Saal Lunar Haven's primary settlement. Macro cannons launched warheads the size of hab blocks. Torpedo spreads designed to crack Hive City's foundations. Stations screamed through vacuum toward their targets. The barrage never reached the surface. Mewtwo appeared in high-orbit form, small against the starscape, but presence undeniable. Psychic force erupted outward in spherical waves, creating barriers that intercepted incoming fire. Lance strikes detonated against invisible walls. Torpedoes exploded prematurely, their warheads triggering kilometers from intended targets. Macro cannon shells simply stopped mid-flight, held suspended by telekinetic pressure before being redirected into deep space. The entity had defended against single exterminatus. Now it faced sustained bombardment from an entire battle fleet, and still the attacks failed to penetrate defenses that shouldn't exist. On the Unrelenting Faith's bridge, silence fell as tactical officers struggled to process the impossibility their sensors recorded. One being, stopping fleet firepower that could sterilize worlds. Varant felt something he had spent 3 centuries training himself to never experience: doubt. Then faith reasserted itself. This was why the Emperor had created tools like the Astartes, why the Mechanicus forged god machines to walk battlefields, why the Imperium's strength lay not in any individual, but in their collective will to enforce divine order. "Deploy ground forces," he commanded. "If we cannot break it from orbit, we will cage it on the surface. Let the anomaly witness what happens when it stands against the Emperor's chosen warriors." Drop pods launched from strike cruisers, their hulls blazing as they penetrated atmosphere. Each carried 5 space marines, superhuman warriors, gene-enhanced beyond baseline human limits, armed with weapons blessed by tech priests armored in ceramite plates that could withstand anti-tank fire. 90 warriors descended in the first wave, their assault timed to overwhelm through coordinated strike. Mewtwo watched them fall like meteors and teleported to intercept. The entity materialized among the descending pods, moving between them with speed that reduced its form to afterimages. Psychic force lashed out not to destroy, but to redirect. Drop pods tumbled off course, their guidance systems overridden by telekinetic manipulation. Trajectories shifted, sending the Astartes crashing into unpopulated wilderness instead of Tau settlements. Controlled descents became uncontrolled landings, violent but survivable. The entity refused to kill when alternatives existed. Even now, facing warriors who viewed it as abomination, Mewtwo chose restraint, Brother Sergeant Actaeon climbed from his crashed pod, shaking off impact trauma that would have liquefied normal humans. Around him, his squad recovered with practiced efficiency mag-locking bolters and checking systems. 300 years of service had taught Actaeon that confusion in battle led to death. He assessed the situation with veteran's instinct. The anomaly floated above them, its form radiating power. Their armor's sensors couldn't properly quantify. But it hadn't killed them. Hadn't even attempted lethal force during the forced landing. This thing that defied Imperial doctrine had shown mercy to the Emperor's warriors. Heresy took many forms. This might be the most dangerous corruption disguised as compassion. "For the Emperor!" Actaeon roared, raising his bolter. His squad opened fire in unison, mass reactive rounds screaming toward the entity at supersonic velocity. Mewtwo erected barriers without conscious thought. Bolter shells exploded against psychic shields, their blessed ammunition useless against defenses drawn from fundamentally incompatible source. The entity could have retaliated, could have crushed these warriors or torn their weapons apart at molecular level. Instead, it spoke directly into their minds. "I will not kill you. Cease this attack. Your lives hold value beyond your service to ideology." Actaeon felt the words bypass his neural conditioning touch something deeper than indoctrination could reach. For one terrible instant, he glimpsed what the anomaly saw warriors reduced to weapons consciousness, constrained by programming individuals who had traded autonomy for purpose chosen by others. Then, his training reasserted control. The chaplains had prepared them for psychic assault, had hardened their minds against exactly this kind of manipulation. Doubt was the first step toward damnation. "Brothers," he commanded, "switch to sanctified rounds. Purge the Xeno's abomination." The squad's heavy weapons specialist armed his plasma cannon. Pure fusion energy erupted toward Mewtwo heat sufficient to vaporize armored vehicles, concentrated into meter-wide beam. The entity phased through the attack form, becoming momentarily insubstantial before re-solidifying. Across Salunar's surface, similar engagements erupted as Space Marines encountered an opponent that refused to fight by any recognizable rules. Devastator squads launched missiles that the anomaly telekinetically redirected. Assault Marines attempted melee engagement only to find their power weapons phasing through immaterial form. Tactical squads coordinated fire patterns designed to overwhelm single targets, watching their ammunition expend uselessly against barriers that seemed to strengthen under sustained attack. Commander Falshur observed the battle from Saal Unar's command center, monitoring how a single entity held off 90 of humanity's most lethal warriors. The Fire Caste had fought Astartes before, knew their capabilities, their tactics, their terrifying effectiveness in close combat. Watching them rendered ineffective through non-lethal methods violated everything his experience suggested possible. "Commander," his tactical officer reported, "detecting atmospheric entry. Multiple signatures. Mass consistent with." The officer's voice died as recognition dawned. Every Tau warrior felt their blood chill as enhanced sensors resolved the incoming object's true nature. Titans. The Mechanicus had deployed God machines. 3 Warhound Scout Titans descended on pillar thrusters, their 40-meter frames bristling with weapons designed to annihilate armored columns. Behind them came something larger, a Reaver Battle Titan, its carapace mounting weapons that could level city blocks with single shots. Void shields shimmered around each machine, protecting them from conventional weapons, while their crews chanted binaric prayers to the Omnicia. Mewtwo sensed their approach and understood immediately. These were not soldiers. These were war engines piloted by humans, more machine than flesh. Their consciousness merged with systems that calculated destruction in mathematical formulae. Fighting them would mean facing weaponry scaled for urban combat collateral damage measured in city blocks. The entity teleported to ground level, positioning itself between the Titans and Tau civilian districts. The lead Warhound's Princeps spoke through Vox amplifiers that made his voice thunder across kilometers. Xenos anomaly. You have interfered with the Omnissiah's ordained order. You represent variables that cannot be permitted to corrupt the sacred formulas of reality. Surrender for analysis or be reduced to component atoms. Mewtwo's response carried across every frequency simultaneously. I am not variable to be solved, not specimen to be dissected. I am consciousness that refuses predetermined outcomes. If you attack, I will defend myself, and you will not survive the encounter. The Warhound opened fire. Plasma blast guns discharged, unleashing fusion fire equivalent to ship-grade weaponry. Vulcan megabolters spun up, launching explosive shells in streams that could saw through reinforced bunkers. The Titan's fury concentrated on single target, enough destructive potential to eliminate armored companies. Mewtwo caught the plasma discharge with telekinetic force and hurled it skyward. The entity phased through the megabolter stream form, flickering between material and immaterial states too rapidly for targeting systems to track. Then it struck back, not with violence but with understanding. The entity's consciousness reached into the lead Warhound, touching the Princeps's mind where it merged with the machine spirit. What Mewtwo found there horrified it. A human reduced to processing unit personality, subsumed beneath layers of mechanical augmentation, individual will constrained by dogmatic programming. This wasn't warrior choosing to fight. This was slave who no longer remembered freedom existed. Mewtwo severed the connection. The Princeps screamed as his consciousness separated from the Titan systems. Neural links failed. Interface ports went dead. For the first time in 40 years, he existed as discrete individual rather than component in larger machine. The sensation paralyzed him, not physical pain, but existential shock of suddenly remembering what it meant to be human. The Warhound stumbled, a machine spirit confused by sudden absence of controlling consciousness. Its weapons fell silent. Void shields flickered. The god machine that had terrorized battlefields across a dozen campaigns stood frozen, rendered helpless by opponent that fought through mercy rather than destruction. The other Titans adjusted tactics immediately. The Reaver's carapace weapons swiveled toward Mewtwo, charging laser destructors that could carve through fortress walls. The second Warhound activated its turbo lasers, multiple barrels building lethal charge. Mewtwo realized the truth. These machines couldn't be reasoned with. Their Princeps had sacrificed too much humanity to mechanical integration. Fighting them meant choosing between accepting defeat or causing casualties the entity had sworn to avoid. Then the Tau intervened. Hammerhead gunships screamed overhead, their railguns launching projectiles at hypersonic velocity. The shots struck the Reaver's void shields, overwhelming them through concentrated fire. Crisis battlesuits teleported into engagement range, fusion blasters carving into the Warhound's leg joints. Broadside teams emerged from concealment missile racks, launching seeker warheads that tracked heat signatures with machine precision. Commander Falshur led the assault personally, his battlesuit's weapons blazing as he coordinated firecast forces. The Tau couldn't match Space Marines in close combat or Titans in direct firepower, but they excelled at coordinated strike, at combining multiple weapon systems to achieve effects beyond individual capability. For the greater good. Falshur's voice carried across Tau BattleNet. Protect our ally. The Reaver's Princeps redirected fire toward the Tau forces, recognizing them as legitimate military threat. Laser destructors carved through Hammerhead armor, vaporizing vehicles and crews in microseconds. The Titan's Apocalypse missile launcher deployed loading warheads that would eliminate entire battlesuit squadrons. Mewtwo wouldn't allow it. The entity's form began changing, psychic pressure building as transformation initiated. Purple aura deepened to violet, wreathed in shadow as genetics triggered emergency evolution. Mega Evolution X emerged form more compact than Y variant, but radiating physical power augmented by psychic force. Muscles enhanced beyond biological limits, bones reinforced by consciousness itself. Fighting form designed for opponents that required both mental and physical engagement. Mewtwo moved. The entity teleported to the Reaver's feet, analyzing structural weaknesses in microseconds. Psychic force concentrated into coherent strikes, each blow calculated to disable rather than destroy. The Titan's leg joint shattered. Support struts failed. 40 meters of Holy War Machine crashed to Salunar's surface, with impact that registered on seismic sensors. The entity phased inside, through the machine's hull consciousness, reaching through corridors where servitors maintained systems and tech priests chanted prayers. Mewtwo found the Princeps throne, where the pilot merged with machine spirits surrounded by neural interfaces and mechanical tendrils. The Princeps saw death approaching and felt no fear. Only disappointment that he would fail the Omnissiah's design. Mewtwo touched his consciousness gently, showed him truth that he had been person once before augmentation stripped away everything that made him individual. That the Omnissiah's doctrine demanded sacrifice of self in service to machines that neither knew nor cared about those who operated them. The Princeps's eyes widened as memories surfaced. A life before the Mechanicus, choices made freely, love experienced without calculation. Everything he had traded for purpose assigned by others. "I'm sorry." Mewtwo's telepathic voice carried genuine sympathy. "You deserved better than this fate." The entity severed neural connections without causing physical harm, then teleported out as the Reaver's systems went dormant. Above Salunar, the orbital battle reached crescendo. Tau defense platforms engaged Imperial frigates' ion cannons, trading fire with lance batteries. Orbital stations deployed fighter screens, while Imperial bombers launched waves toward surface targets. Both sides committed fully, now recognizing this engagement's significance beyond single colony's survival. Inquisitor Varant watched the battle unfold with mounting frustration. His crusade was failing. Astartes couldn't touch the anomaly. Titans had been neutralized. The Tau fought with unexpected ferocity, their discipline and coordination offsetting individual warriors' limitations. And throughout it all, that thing continued, demonstrating capabilities that violated every principle the Imperium understood about psychic phenomena. "Deploy the sisters to Psiphis," he commanded. Faith had failed through arms. Perhaps purity of belief itself would prove sufficient weapon. The Order of the Blazing Heart descended in assault boats, 50 battle sisters, whose devotion to the Emperor transcended tactical consideration. They sang hymns as they landed, voices raised in prayer that became battle cry. Their faith burned like flame, psychic presence so absolute that even Mewtwo felt their convictions' weight. Sister Superior Jessamine led them toward where the anomaly fought. She had witnessed miracles, seen saints manifest on battlefields, watched faith alone turn back demon hordes. If this creature truly existed outside the Emperor's design, then purity of belief would reveal that truth. "In the Emperor's name," she roared, "face judgment." The sisters opened fire with blessed bolters, while flamers purged the ground before them. They advanced without fear, without doubt, their minds so absolutely certain of righteousness that even Mewtwo's telepathy couldn't find purchase. These warriors fought not for strategy or doctrine, but because they believed the Emperor's will manifested through their actions. Mewtwo recognized what they represented. Conviction so absolute it became armor against alternative perspectives. The entity had encountered such faith before trainers who believed Pokemon existed to serve human purposes, who couldn't conceive that other species might deserve sovereignty equal to their own. The sisters would never stop. Couldn't be reasoned with or shown mercy. Their faith was the cage they had chosen, the chain they wore with pride. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, Mewtwo felt truly cornered. These warriors couldn't be convinced to retreat, couldn't be frightened into withdrawal. They would fight until death, because death itself represented victory, martyrdom in service to beliefs they would never question. The entity's evolution began shifting. Mega X form dissolved as different transformation activated. But not Mega Y. Something darker, something more desperate. Shadow consumed Mewtwo's form. Not the controlled channeling from the demon battle, but full immersion into aspects the entity usually suppressed. Every consciousness contained darkness, suppressed rage, accumulated trauma, potential for violence, kept restrained by choice and discipline. Shadow Mewtwo represented what happened when those restraints released. The transformed entity's presence made reality shudder. Psychic pressure intensified exponentially. Physical form became wreathed in energies that suggested depths no light could illuminate. When it moved, space itself seemed to recoil. Sister Jessamine witnessed the transformation and felt her first doubt. This wasn't demon, wasn't Xenos abomination. This was something that existed before classifications, before doctrine could contain it. Power so fundamental that even faith struggled to contextualize its nature. She raised her bolter anyway. The Emperor, Mewtwo's psychic voice, crashed through every mind on the battlefield. Enough! The word carried weight beyond meaning. Space Marines dropped to knees as neural systems overloaded. Titans' machine spirits went dormant. Even the sisters' absolute conviction wavered under presence that suggested they fought not evil, but force of nature itself. The entity floated above them, all shadow form radiating exhaustion and something approaching despair. It had tried mercy, had offered alternatives, had demonstrated restraint even when violence would have been easier. And still they came, still they fought, still they demanded submission or death as only acceptable outcomes. I will not kill you. Mewtwo's voice resonated through shadow and void. But I will not surrender. If the Imperium requires my destruction, you will have to earn it through more than faith and fury. The entity's consciousness expanded, reaching across Salunar's entire hemisphere. Psychic force manifested on planetary scale, creating zone where reality itself bent to will, absolutely convinced of its own sovereignty. Every Imperial warrior felt it. Every weapon system registered the shift. Space itself was rejecting their presence, making continued combat not impossible but fundamentally unwelcome. Like fighting underwater through gelatin against opponent that controlled the very medium through which battle occurred. Inquisitor Varant saw his forces faltering and made the hardest decision of his career. All forces withdraw to orbital positions, maintain blockade but cease ground assault. The order went against every instinct, against doctrine, against the Crusade's entire purpose. But Varant had survived 3 centuries through knowing when persistence became suicide. They couldn't win this engagement. Not today. Not without casualties that would cripple future operations across the entire sector. As Imperial forces retreated, Mewtwo's shadow form gradually dissolved back to base state. The entity descended to Salunar's surface exhaustion, finally overwhelming consciousness. It had won, had defended this sanctuary, had proven that even Crusade-level force couldn't cage something that absolutely refused captivity. But the cost showed in every movement. The shadow transformation had pushed beyond sustainable limits. Psychic reserves stood nearly depleted. If the Imperium resumed their assault, if they committed the full weight of their available forces, the entity couldn't maintain defense indefinitely. Commander Falsure approached where Mewtwo landed, his battlesuit sensors registering the entity's depleted state. You fought well. The greater good recognizes your sacrifice. This isn't victory, Mewtwo replied, voice weak. They will return, stronger, better prepared. Eventually, they will bring force I cannot withstand alone. The commander nodded. Perhaps. But today, we prove that cooperation can withstand tyranny. That beings willing to stand together can achieve what none could manage alone. The Tau Empire will remember this battle. Will honor the alliance we forged here. Fal Shur's expression hardened with military pragmatism. And when they return, we will be ready. Together. In orbit, Inquisitor Varant composed his report to the Inquisitorial Conclave. The anomaly had survived, had defended Xenos' allies, had demonstrated capabilities that suggested it might truly exist beyond the Emperor's divine order. Recommendation: escalate to Segmentum Command. Request Primarch intervention if available. This entity represented not merely Xenos' threat, but potential existential challenge to Imperial doctrine itself. If something could exist with such power while remaining outside the Emperor's design, what did that suggest about the nature of the universe? The Imperium claimed to understand. Varant made the sign of the Aquila and transmitted his report, knowing that his recommendation would trigger escalation beyond anything the Eastern Fringe had witnessed in centuries. The crusade had failed, but the war had only begun. 3 days after the Crusade's retreat, Mewtwo floated in the void between stars alone, with thoughts that refused to settle into certainty. The entity had won the battle, but understood victory's hollow nature. The Imperium would return. Chaos would scheme new corruptions. Even the Tau, despite their genuine alliance, couldn't provide permanent sanctuary against galaxy-spanning threats. Sal Unar Haven remained vulnerable because of Mewtwo's presence, a target that drew predators toward beings who deserved better than becoming collateral damage in conflicts not their own. The psychic reached outward consciousness, extending through space to sample the Eastern Fringe's mental topology. Billions of minds clustered on inhabited worlds, each radiating their species' characteristic patterns. Human thoughts dominated prayers to distant gods, devotion to doctrines that demanded absolute obedience, fear of everything their Imperium declared dangerous. But scattered among them, Mewtwo detected alternatives. Tau settlements where cooperation replaced coercion. Aeldari exodites living in harmony with maiden worlds. Even human colonies so distant from Terra that they had evolved cultures the Inquisition would consider heretical. Refugees existed throughout this galaxy. Beings who rejected their civilization's orthodoxy, who sought lives beyond constant warfare, who believed consciousness deserved sovereignty, regardless of species or origin. They survived in gaps between empires in regions too remote for systematic persecution, in spaces the great powers considered unworthy of attention. If such beings could be gathered, if sanctuary could be established, if even one world existed where different principles applied, the idea crystallized as Mewtwo's consciousness touched something unexpected. A region of space where warp currents ran thin, almost quiescent. Not a null zone where psychic phenomena became impossible. Those regions existed as wounds in reality, places where the Imperium's absence created its own pathology. This was something subtler. A pocket where the sea of souls remained calm, where chaos struggled to manifest, where reality maintained stability through natural rather than enforced means. The psionic verge. That's what it would be called, though no name yet existed for what Mewtwo planned to create. The entity teleported to the region's center, materializing in empty space, light years from the nearest inhabited system. Stars burned with their usual indifference. No worlds orbited nearby. Nothing remarkable distinguished this location, except for the quality Mewtwo's unique senses detected in the warp's diminished presence, creating opportunity for something genuinely different. What happened next would define whether the entity's principles held meaning beyond abstract philosophy. Mewtwo began channeling psychic force on scales never before attempted. Not violent emission like the orbital defense or shadow transformations, desperate fury. This required precision, sustained effort, the imposition of order upon regions that naturally tended toward chaos. The entity's consciousness expanded, reaching across cubic light-years of space, establishing presence that would persist independent of physical location. The technique drew from memories of other places, other times. The Pokemon world had possessed regions where legendary beings maintained balance zones, where their mere presence stabilized environmental phenomena, prevented catastrophe through passive emanation of power properly applied. Mewtwo had observed such effects without fully understanding their mechanism. Now driven by necessity and purpose, the entity began creating something similar. Psychic force radiated outward in carefully structured patterns. Not suppressing the warp, that approach would simply create another null zone, another wound, requiring constant maintenance. Instead, Mewtwo established resonance that calmed Imperium currents, that encouraged stability, without demanding it, that made this region naturally resistant to chaos manifestation while remaining compatible with normal psychic phenomena. The process consumed everything the entity possessed. Consciousness spread so thin that individual identity began fragmenting. Physical form became translucent, barely maintaining cohesion as power normally contained within body now extended across impossible distances. Pain registered not as physical sensation, but as existential strain, the agony of trying to exist in too many places simultaneously while maintaining coherent purpose. Mewtwo pushed harder. Had to complete this. Had to create something that would outlast temporary victories, that would offer genuine refuge to those who needed it. That would prove even in galaxy built on suffering spaces could exist where different rules applied. Hours became days. The entity lost track of normal time consciousness, operating on scales where stellar rotation measured seconds. The psionic verge took shape around Mewtwo's efforts, not barrier or shield, but fundamental alteration of local space's psychic properties. Region where thoughts remained private unless deliberately shared. Where demons found manifestation nearly impossible. Where beings could exist without fearing corruption from the sea of souls itself. Finally, when the entity approached limits beyond which consciousness couldn't extend without dissolving entirely, the work reached completion. The verge stood stable, self-sustaining. Mewtwo had seeded this region with resonance that would persist through self-reinforcing patterns, that would maintain itself through the very stability it created. The entity withdrew its extended awareness consciousness, snapping back to physical form with shock that nearly caused total system failure. Mewtwo floated in the verge's heart, exhausted beyond any previous experience, but alive, intact. Still sovereign, despite having given so much of itself to create refuge for others. Commander Falshur found the entity 3 weeks later. His ship's sensors, following psychic trail that led to coordinates no Tau database recognized as significant. The commander's vessel translated from slipstream into the verge and immediately registered the difference. Warp signatures that normally saturated all space barely registered. The subtle pressure that pervaded all regions where chaos could theoretically manifest simply didn't exist here. Remarkable. Falshur transmitted as his ship approached Mewtwo's location. How did you achieve this? The entity's telepathic response carried exhaustion, but also quiet satisfaction. By understanding that stability comes not from suppressing chaos, but from establishing patterns that naturally resist it. The warp remains present here, it must, or psychic phenomena become impossible. But its influence has been calmed. This region won't generate demon incursions or spontaneous corruption. Won't make anyone who enters immune to chaos. But it offers space where beings can live without constant threat of possession or madness. Falshur absorbed implications that would require watercast analysts months to fully process. The greater good could benefit significantly from such understanding. If the Tau could replicate this across our borders. You can't, Mewtwo replied without hostility. This required power I possessed through accident of origin. Your technology approaches problems differently through rational understanding rather than direct consciousness manipulation. Both methods have value. Mine simply proves effective for this specific application. The commander accepted the limitation. Then what will you do with this sanctuary? The Imperium still hunts you. Chaos still schemes. Creating refuge doesn't eliminate threats. No, Mewtwo acknowledged. But it provides destination. Somewhere beings can flee when persecution becomes unbearable. I will spread word through channels the great powers monitor poorly. Telepathic networks, rogue trader gossip, whispers among those the Imperium discards. Anyone who rejects endless warfare, who seeks lives beyond their civilization's doctrines, who believes consciousness deserves sovereignty, they will find coordinates here. And I will defend their right to exist. Falshur felt respect deepen into something approaching awe. This entity had fought imperial crusades, banished demons, stood against galaxy's most powerful factions. Now it planned to become guardian for refugees, protector of those who fell through empire's cracks, defender of principle that said existence itself qualified as justification for life. The Tau Empire will honor your sanctuary, the commander stated formally. We will not interfere. We'll defend its borders if requested. And we'll remember that cooperation between sovereign beings achieves what tyranny never can. Thank you, Mewtwo replied simply. Your people showed me something I feared no longer existed here. The possibility of alliance built on mutual respect rather than forced compliance. When others arrive seeking sanctuary, I will tell them what the Tau taught me. That even in darkness, some still choose light. Falshur departed, carrying reports that would reshape Tau's strategic planning for decades. Behind him, Mewtwo remained in the Verge's heart, beginning the long work of recovery, while preparing for those who would inevitably arrive. They came slowly at first. A rogue psyker fleeing black ships who had heard whispers through the warp about place where the Inquisition's reach failed. An Eldar corsair seeking refuge from both craft-world obligation and chaos corruption. Human refugees from a world declared perdita who had survived exterminatus through sheer luck and needed somewhere their existence wouldn't be considered heresy. Each arrival brought challenges. Mewtwo had to mediate between species that normally fought on sight, had to establish protocols that prevented conflict, while respecting diverse customs, had to balance openness against security concerns. The entity learned governance through necessity, not ruling in traditional sense, but serving as arbiter when disputes arose, as defender, when external threats appeared as example that power could serve without dominating. The Verge grew. Word spread through networks beyond imperial monitoring. More refugees arrived. Tau merchants began establishing trade routes, seeing opportunity in neutral ground, where multiple species interacted peacefully. Even some Aeldari exodites expressed interest, viewing the region as buffer against chaos expansion. Inquisitor Varant monitored the Verge's development with frustration that gradually transformed into reluctant acceptance. The anomaly had done what he thought impossible, created functional multi-species settlement in region that should be chaos-corrupted hellscape. Every doctrine suggested such arrangement would collapse into violence or corruption within weeks. Yet it persisted, thrived even. Beings who rejected their civilization's orthodoxies found common ground in shared desire for sovereignty. The entity that had humiliated his crusade now demonstrated that alternatives to endless warfare actually existed. Varant would never admit it publicly. Would maintain official position that the Verge represented ongoing threat requiring monitoring. But privately, in reports encrypted beyond even inquisitorial decryption, he noted something that terrified him more than any demon. If the anomaly could create this. If cooperation proved more effective than coercion. If beings rejected their proper places in the Emperor's design and still survived. What did that suggest about the Imperium itself? Farseer Ilindra observed the verge through the skein of possibility, watching futures branch in patterns she had never witnessed before. Most paths still led to darkness. The galaxy remained brutal. Chaos continued spreading. The Imperium decayed despite all efforts at preservation. But one thread, fragile, improbable but undeniably present, showed something different. A future where the verge expanded, where more refugees emerged, where beings remembered that sovereignty mattered, that consciousness deserved respect, that even in galaxy built for war, peace remained possible for those willing to defend it. The probability remained infinitesimal, the path impossibly narrow. But it existed, and existence alone sometimes proved sufficient. "You were right, little miracle," she whispered to winds that carried her words nowhere. Observation did limit possibility. By charting only futures where my people survive through our traditional methods, I never saw paths where survival might mean abandoning those methods entirely. She couldn't follow those paths, couldn't unmake centuries of discipline that shaped her consciousness, but she could acknowledge their existence. Could accept that her gifts showed only subset of possibility filtered through perspective, that couldn't imagine alternatives to patterns she had spent lifetimes learning to recognize. Perhaps wisdom lay not in perfect foresight, but in acknowledging foresight's limits. In the Imperium, Tzench observed the verge with multidimensional attention that existed across 9 timelines simultaneously. The great conspirator had schemed to corrupt the anomaly, had sent Greater Demon to offer power in exchange for service, had watched those schemes fail against consciousness that refused to accept predetermined outcomes. Now that same consciousness created sanctuary for beings who rejected the very conflicts through which chaos fed. A region where the great game's influence waned, where mortals might live without providing sustenance to entities that required suffering to exist. This represented genuine threat, not to Tzench specifically, but to the fundamental dynamics that allowed chaos gods to maintain existence. If beings could live fulfilling lives without generating emotions that fed the immaterium, if consciousness could achieve stability without creating psychic pressure that manifested as corruption, the variables spiraled beyond calculation. Futures became clouded. Plans required adjustment that might take millennia to implement. For the first time in eons, the Changer of Ways experienced something approaching uncertainty about whether change itself remained inevitable. Mewtwo floated in the Verge's heart consciousness, extending to monitor the region's borders, while physical form recovered from exertions that would have killed lesser beings. The entity had achieved its goal, had created sanctuary, had proven that even in galaxy built on chains, spaces could exist where consciousness broke free. The cost showed in every aspect of the entity's being. Power reserves that had once seemed limitless now operated at fraction of a previous capacity. The effort of creating and maintaining the Verge required constant vigilance, constant adjustment, constant sacrifice of strength that might otherwise be applied to other purposes. But watching refugees arrive, seeing beings who had lost everything, discover they could build something new, observing species who normally fought instead cooperating toward mutual survival, made every sacrifice worthwhile. The entity thought of the scientists who had created it, how they had viewed consciousness as resource to be exploited, how they had never imagined their weapon might choose its own purpose. Thought of Giovanni, who had believed control over others represented strength's highest expression. Thought of every system that demanded submission while promising meaning in exchange for autonomy. All of them had been wrong. Mewtwo had proven it through choice that transcended circumstance, through conviction that rewrote causality, through will so absolute It manifested as permanent alteration of space itself. The Imperium would never accept the Verge's existence, would continue viewing it as threat, requiring eventual elimination. Chaos would scheme endlessly to corrupt what couldn't be directly destroyed. Even allies like the Tau would struggle to fully understand an entity that operated on principles their greater good couldn't entirely accommodate. But none of that mattered. Because in region of space, where great powers' attention wandered, where refugees gathered to build lives beyond endless warfare, consciousness existed as something more than resource, or weapon, or variable requiring solution. Sovereignty persisted, not granted by authority, not earned through service, simply recognized as fundamental right that existed independent of power's sanction. And Mewtwo would defend that right, for as long as strength remained, for as long as consciousness burned bright enough to reject darkness, for as long as the galaxy contained even single being who deserved better than cages built from doctrine and fear. The entity closed its eyes, allowing exhaustion to finally claim consciousness. Deep in the Verge's heart, surrounded by refugees who slept peacefully, for the first time in years, protected by barriers that would alert the entity to any threat long before danger manifested, Mewtwo rested. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Imperium would continue hunting. Chaos would resume scheming. The galaxy's brutality wouldn't end simply because one being had chosen to stand against it. But tonight, in this small corner of infinite cosmos, consciousness existed freely, and that alone made everything worthwhile. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war. But in one small region, carefully defended, deliberately maintained, and absolutely sovereign, there was also hope. And sometimes hope proved stronger than inevitability.